into that passage in a moment. It is a tricky passage. It's complex. If you're in community groups this week, you might have had a whole bunch of questions raised. And we're going to get into that in a moment. But I want to start by thinking about what it means to be clever. Because the idea of being clever or wise is really at the heart of what this passage is all about. You can see it there in verse 8. The master in this story commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. And the word shrewd there is interesting. We often associate being shrewd with kind of having negative connotations, you know, a little bit like being cunning, you know, someone who's smart but mean. The Greek word there, it doesn't have any of those negative connotations. The word just means wise, smart, insightful, thoughtful, clever. It's a word that's often used in Proverbs to describe the wise person who has understanding. And what's interesting is in the ancient world, that idea of being wise or clever, it was held up as one of the great virtues. And so, you know, Aristotle, blah, 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 he said, what you want to be above all else is clever. Be wise, be thoughtful. And in some ways, I think our culture today is really not all that different. There's a sense in which we live in a culture of cleverness. It's something we value. You know, whether it's that person who's like just really quick-witted, they're funny, or, you know, there's the person who's always listening to some kind of interesting podcast. You know, they're reading some interesting book. The person who always has an opinion on history or politics. That culture begins when we're young. We want our children to be clever, don't we? You know, we send them to the best schools to get the best education. We want them to be gifted, talented, and that extends through to university, studying. You know, when you're at uni, there's a pressure to perform, to succeed, exams, assessments. Even if you're in the workforce, there's a pressure to do further study. You know, master's, PhD, to demonstrate you're someone who's knowledgeable, who has insights that you can bring. You know, there's that moment, you know, when you're working with a team and you're trying to solve some problem and you just can't see a way forward. And then there's that person who just has this moment of clarity and insight, and they think outside the box, they come up with a creative solution, and you go, that's clever, that's clever. There's even a Christian version. We do it too. You know, someone who knows the Bible inside and out. You know, they've read a whole bunch of, you know, really great Christian books. You know, they're articulate. They can answer tough questions. Here's the question, though. The question I want us to ask today is, what does God think about being clever? What we're going to see in this passage today is that Jesus does want us to be clever and insightful. He wants us to be wise. The main character in the story today, this manager that we're going to hear about, he's held up as doing something clever, and Jesus says there's something there for us to learn, to emulate. We need to learn to be clever, like this guy. And yet, and this is the crucial thing, we're also going to see that what God thinks is clever is something totally different to what we often think is clever and the world around us. So, I reckon if we can wrap our heads around that and why that's the case, I think that's going to unlock this passage for us. So I want to ask two questions today. First, what made the manager in this story so clever? And second, how can we learn to be clever according to what God thinks is clever? So let's jump in and ask, what made the manager in this story so clever? We'll start with some context. You might remember last week, chapter 15, Jesus has been speaking to a big group of people, and there's actually a whole mix of people. We're told that there's sinners there, there's tax collectors, but there's also the religious elite, the Pharisees, big mix of people. And in our passage today, Jesus is going to start to speak to another kind of person in that mix. He's going to speak to his disciples, his followers. You can see that in verse 1, it's how it starts. Jesus told his disciples. Now remember, all those other kinds of people, they're still there. You see that later in the passage. Remember the Pharisees? They're listening in. They're going to get upset about what Jesus says. But the point is, Jesus is speaking to his disciples here. He's teaching them what it means to follow him. If you're here today and you wouldn't call yourself a follower of Jesus, it is good to have you. And today's passage is going to give you a window into what it might look like for you to start following Jesus. And for those of us who are followers of Jesus, this passage is going to give us another angle, a perspective on what it means to do the daily task of taking up our cross and following Jesus. So what does Jesus say to his disciples? He tells them a story. He tells them a parable. And it centers on two main characters. The first character, we're told, is a rich man. We're introduced to him in verse 1. The rich man, he's also called the master later on. So that's the first character, rich man, the master. The second character is also introduced in verse 1, and he is the manager. And so we've got the master and the manager. They're our guys. And this manager has responsibility for managing his master's resources. He's almost like a personal treasurer, someone who has financial control over the master's assets. But the complication of this story is that this manager has been accused of wasting his master's resources. Now, we aren't told whether this is true or not. Based on what happens later, I think it probably is true. He's that kind of guy. But the point of the accusation is that this manager, he's been found out, he's been discovered. And so the question is, what's the master going to do? We're told in verse 2. Have a look. So he, the master, called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." So this manager, he's essentially given his notice of termination. He's been fired. But first, he needs to settle the books so that he can hand everything back to the master. That's what it means for him to give an account of his management. He needs to settle the books. So this manager, he's on his way out. He's been given notice of termination, but he has this small little window of time where he still has to settle the books. And so what's he going to do? Stop there, have a think. What would you do? You're losing your job. You've been fired for misconduct, which means you can't get a job anywhere else. In the ancient world, there's no government support. And if you can't get another job, you're either going to end up as a servant digging, or you're going to end up on the street begging. So, what do? Do you try and go back to the master and try and get back on good terms? You know, do you try and fight the accusation and, clear your name? Here's what this manager does. So we're going to read verses 3 to 7. This is what he does. The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." And it goes on. So he called in each of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. And the manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. And it goes on. Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. Okay. Bunch of things to notice here. First, notice the motivation of the manager. His motivation is not to try and get back in the good books of the master. Some commentaries you read will say that what this manager did was really for the good of the master, to get back on good terms. So some people will say, this manager, what he did, he sacrificed his cut of the profits so that this master could have his debts paid back more quickly. Or others will say, this master, he'd been charging too much interest. That was illegal according to Jewish law. And so maybe this manager, what he'd done is he'd cut out the illegal interest so that this master wouldn't be found out to be doing something wrong. Problem is, I don't think that's what the passage is saying. The manager here is quite clear on his motivations. He knows he's losing his job, and there's no hope that he'll keep it. So notice he says, when I lose my job here, he knows he's on the way out. And so what's his motivation? Well, when he's fired, he wants somewhere to go. So he doesn't end up on the street or as a servant. We're told that what he does here, he's doing it so that people will welcome him into their homes. He wants somewhere to go. So what does he do? Well, this is where we have these other characters introduced. And these are the people who owe debts to this master. We're told specifically about 2. There might have been more. And these people owed massive debts to this master. So one owed 900 gallons of olive oil. It's about 3,500 litres. It's worth a lot. In the ancient world, people think it was maybe worth like 18 months to 2 years' worth of wages. So it's a big debt. Similar for the guy who owed the wheat. He had a big debt. And what this manager does is he cuts these people massive deals. 50% off for the one who owed the oil. 20% off for the guy who owed the wheat. So if you got a mortgage, just imagine that. 50% off. Now, was it shady for him to cut these deals? Yes, I think so. Notice in verse 6 the word quickly there. Sit down quickly. It's almost like the manager knows that what he's doing is dodgy, and so he says, quick, sit down, change the debt before anyone notices. I'll approve it. They don't want to get caught. So it seems dodgy. He's ultimately robbed his master of the debts that he was owed. This manager, he has cheated and robbed his master in the very last moments of his employment. Why? Why did he do it? As we saw, we're told that he did all this so that when he was fired, there would be a bunch of people, these people with debts, who felt like they owed this manager because he cut them a good deal, and so they would welcome him into their homes and he wouldn't have to live on the streets or be a servant. So that's what he does. How does the master respond? And this is the really interesting bit. But what would you do? Imagine you're the master. So this manager, he hands you back the books, and you notice he's cut all these people massive deals. You've effectively lost a whole lot of money. You've basically been scammed. You're a victim of fraud. What do you do? Here's what this master does. Have a look, verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Now, did the manager do the wrong thing? Yeah, we're actually given a reminder here. He'd been dishonest in what he'd done. The word there is more accurately translated as unrighteous. He was unjust, unrighteous. But what did the master do? He commended him. And that's really the big puzzle of the parable. Why would the master commend him? Just notice, he doesn't commend everything that the manager does. It's not like he's saying, well done, great job, thanks for stealing my riches. It's not what he's saying. Notice he commends the manager for something in particular. He says that what this manager had done was very shrewd, which, as we saw, just means clever, wise. It was thoughtful. He's not, notice the manager, he's not commended for doing something good. He's not commended for doing something righteous. He's commended for doing something clever. It's almost like this master. He says to his manager, look, I really wish that you didn't do it. I'm not happy about it, but I have to hand it to you. Well played. That was clever. Think about, a movie like Ocean's 11, any classic, heist movie. The good guys, they're trying to break in and steal something, breaking into a casino, breaking into a bank. And what they do, they basically engage in a whole lot of deception, fraud, and theft. And we all know that what they're doing is wrong. It's illegal, and they probably should end up in jail. But it's really clever, isn't it? I think that's what's going on here. The master, he's not happy, but he's got to give credit where credit's due. This guy had done something very clever. But why? Why was it so clever? What made this clever? Remember, that's the big question we're trying to answer. What made this manager so clever? I think there's a few things. First, he recognized that his time was up. He knew that the circumstances that he'd enjoyed for so long, being manager of the master's assets, he knew that that was all coming to an end. He was on his way out. Now, he could have deluded himself into thinking that things would all be fine. Things are never going to change. It'll be fine. If he'd done that, what would happen? He ends up on the street, or he ends up as a servant, too weak to dig. But he didn't do that. He was clever. He was thoughtful. He confronted the fact that his time was up, and he thought about the future. He's got a plan. And so the second clever thing he does is that he uses everything that he has in order to build for his future. He uses all the resources he has to ensure that he had somewhere to go. That's what made him clever. That's our first question. What made this manager clever? Second question is, how can we learn to be clever too? At least according to what God thinks is clever. And that's really the important question here. Jesus, he's not telling a story just for the sake of telling a good story. He's telling this story because he thinks that it teaches us something important about what it means to follow him. He's speaking to his disciples. He's teaching them what it means to follow. And so the question is, what do we learn from this story about the clever manager? How do we learn to be clever too? I reckon there's at least 3 key lessons for us to learn, and I'll just give them to you as we go. First, we need to recognize the times. Remember, the first clever thing that the manager did was that he recognized the times. His present circumstances coming to an end, and he was thinking about the future. The lesson for us here is that our world is coming to an end. Our world has been given a notice of termination. It's coming to an end. I think that's exactly what Jesus goes on to say in the verses that follow. So notice what Jesus says, verse 9. So this is to the disciples. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Just notice there is a time coming when worldly wealth will fail. It will be gone. There's a time coming when actually the world itself will be drawn to a close. Just notice, it won't be an accident when the world comes to an end. It won't be an asteroid hitting the earth, unless God throws it or something. It's not in my script. The world will come to an end when it is judged by its master, just like this manager was judged by his master for squandering his wealth. Think about it. Whose wealth have we squandered? God is the one who made all things. He's the rightful owner over all things. And as Genesis tells us, God entrusted us with what he had made, humanity, Adam and Eve, his image bearers. But what did we do with all the things that God entrusted to us? We squandered it. We wasted it. We spent what was his, and we spent it on ourselves. In Romans 1, Paul, he says, we worshipped and served the creation rather than the creator. And Paul says that in doing so, we thought we were being wise, but actually we became fools. And by squandering all the things that God has entrusted to us, created things, we squandered it all. We thought we were being clever, but in fact we became fools. That's what the Bible calls sin, and it's foolish. It's unwise to take the things that God has entrusted to us and to squander them on ourselves. I think, you remember last week, I think there's a parallel here to, you remember the younger brother? He goes and he squanders all that belonged to his father. Both are images of squandering, waste. And as a result of this, we stand accused. Remember this manager, he was accused of doing these things. So too, we have been accused. By who? By Satan. So, just look carefully. So verse 1, when Luke uses the word accused there, it's actually a very rare word. This is actually the only place that this word is used in the New Testament, which means Luke is using this word on purpose. And the word there, accused, it comes from another root word that means accuser. And in Greek, that word is diabolos. And there's actually a character in the book of Luke who has the name Diabolos. It's the devil. It's Satan. The word diabolos is actually where we get the English word devil from. Think of Luke chapter 4. You remember Jesus is in the wilderness. Satan comes to tempt him. He's called the diabolos, the accuser. So what's the point? What's Luke doing? I think he's saying that just like this manager was accused of wrongdoing, so too we have all been accused and charged with wrongdoing. And the person who brings that accusation, the person who wants to see us charged, is Satan, the devil, the diabolos. So let me ask you, do you ever feel weighed down by guilt? Do you ever feel the burden of condemnation? Do you know that feeling of being confronted with your sin, of wrongdoing? That's the work of Satan. And left to ourselves, we don't have a leg to stand on. We are guilty. Just like this manager was served his termination notice, so too God has served this world with its termination notice. There will come a time when worldly wealth will fail. God, the judge, the master, he will come to judge the world. Us. But is that the end of it? Are we all just doomed to face our charges and be terminated? Or is there another way? Is there a possibility of a different kind of future? The whole point of this parable is to say that there is another way. There is a possibility of a different kind of future, one where we are welcomed into new homes, where we'll have new friends. Jesus says, just like this manager experienced a different kind of future, so too there is a possibility on offer to us of having a different kind of future, of hope. Remember what Jesus says in verse 9. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Notice that. Just as this manager was welcomed into a new home, so too there is a possibility for us to be welcomed into an eternal dwelling, to find new friends. What's he saying? He's saying that there is an eternal home that lasts beyond this world. He's talking about heaven, the kingdom of God. The condemnation of Satan doesn't have to be the final word. There is a possibility of another future. And so the first lesson of this parable is that we need to recognize the times. We need to recognize this world's passing away. It's been served its termination notice, and there is another future coming, a future where there is an eternal home. And what God thinks is clever is to be clued into that reality. Here's the thing though, it's hard to be clued into that reality. It's hard to recognize that this world is passing away and that there's another future coming. It's hard. I think that's what Jesus is saying in the second half of verse 8. So do you remember that bit? It's kind of confusing. He says, the people of this world are more shrewd, more clever in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. And at first, it kind of sounds like Jesus is having a crack at those who follow him. You know, he's kind of having a go. You guys, Christians, you're not all that clever. You're not that wise. People of this world, they get it. They're clever. They're wise. Is that what Jesus is saying? I think that's kind of right, but I think there's actually a little bit more going on. So, what I think he's saying is that when someone is threatened in this life and this world, they scramble. They do everything they can to secure their future. They know that their life is under threat, and so they twist, they lie, they cheat, because they're desperate to secure their future. That's precisely what the manager did in this story. That's what it means for the people of this world to be shrewd or clever in dealing with their own kind. They see when their future's under threat, and so they do whatever they have to do to secure their future. That's the clever bit. It's wise to do that. Not wise to steal and cheat and lie. Wise to recognise what's going on. But the people of the light, it's harder for us. We don't understand that God is coming to judge this world. We forget that worldly wealth will fail. This world, we act like this world and this life is just going to keep on going on and on and on. We don't set our minds on what's to come. In other words, it's easy for us to be consumed in the here and now of everyday life, this world. It's harder to set our minds on what's to come. But Jesus says if you want to be truly clever, we need to recognize the times. Worldly wealth will fail. This world is passing away, and the wise thing, the clever thing, is to set your hope on a home that will last into eternity. That's the first lesson. Recognize the times. Second lesson, use what you have now to build for that future. See, this manager, he didn't just recognize the times, he acted to secure his future. He was building for the future. I think there's a lesson there for us. Just like this manager, we are meant to use everything we have in order to build for that future of an eternal home. Now, we need to be careful about the parallels here. Are we meant to lie and steal and cheat like the unrighteous manager did? No, don't do that. But we are similar to this manager in that none of our resources actually belong to us. It's not our wealth. It's the master's. It's God's. And yet, we are meant to use what we have, what doesn't belong to us, in order to build for our future. I think that's what Jesus means when he talks about being faithful with worldly wealth, being faithful with what belongs to someone else. So have a look, verse 11 to 12. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Now, there's a complication here. It's one of the things that makes this passage so tricky. It's tricky. All right. If you've got an ESV translation there, you might notice it doesn't say worldly wealth in verse 11. It calls it unrighteous wealth. And that's actually a better translation. Back in verse 9, Jesus says, use worldly wealth to gain friends. Same thing. He says, use unrighteous wealth. And the point is that nothing we have belongs to us. We're people who have betrayed our master. And these things includes our money, the dollars in our bank account, but it includes all the resources that we have. It all belongs to God. It's not ours. And yet, so here's the tricky thing. Jesus says that there is a right way to use unrighteous wealth and there is a wrong way to use it. So can you see the tension there? I'm like, why is it so tricky? He says you can use unrighteous wealth well, or you can use it badly. And the right way, the trustworthy way to use unrighteous wealth is to use it to build for our future. That's what this manager did. He used what was not his to build for his future. Jesus says that's the right way to use unrighteous wealth. Jesus says if we can do that, one day we will be given property of our own. We will inherit true riches, as he says. What does that mean? What does it mean to build for our future? Jesus tells us in verse 9. In some ways, this is really the key application of this passage. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth, literally unrighteous wealth, to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Okay, so we're meant to use all our wealth, our resources, to gain friends for ourselves, so we'll be welcomed in. Who are the friends? Is this a reference to Jesus? You know, what a friend we have in Jesus. It's a good song. Is this Jesus here? Is he the friend? I don't think so. And I think you get it when you think back to the parable. Who were the people who welcomed the manager into their homes? They were people who all owed an enormous debt to the master. They were all in danger of ending up in the same place as the manager. If they couldn't pay their debts, they would end up as servants, and they'd end up digging or on the streets. They were facing the same fate as the manager. So who are these friends that Jesus says we should make? I wonder if these friends are a reference to all the people around us who are all in danger of falling under the same judgment as we are. Basically, I think it's people like you and me, people who owe a great debt to the master. Another way of thinking about it is that these are the friends who we will join with in celebration. So remember last week, the lost things were found. And remember, when the lost things were found, the friends and the neighbours were called to come and celebrate. These are the people who will rejoice with us in eternity, our friends. And what Jesus says is we have an opportunity to make friends so that when we get to heaven, we will celebrate together. The big point is that our wealth now can be used to have an effect that lasts into eternity. Now, just notice there's a difference here between the underlying motivation of the manager and the underlying motivation that we should have. You know, the manager, he ultimately did everything out of selfishness, a concern for his own security. That's not meant to be our motivation. I think it's there in the word friends. This manager just used people. But that's not what a friend does. A friend loves. A friend cares. And Jesus says we are to use everything we have to make friends. And not just friends in this life, but friends who will be there in an eternal dwelling. It's radically other person centered. And that's what it means to use what doesn't belong to us to build for the future. Application here, use everything we have to make friends who will be there in eternity. One more lesson. We need to remember who our true master is. See, the whole way through, this parable has been operating at different levels, which is part of why it's so complex. At one level, it's describing how people function and act in this world. And that's really the world that this manager functions in this story. He is the prime example of a person of this world who deals with his own kind. But Jesus draws parallels from how this world works, and he applies it to spiritual realities, things like heaven and hell, being people of the light, making friends for eternity. What Jesus does in verse 13 is he cuts across all these parallels. And he says, people of this world, they have one kind of master. People of the light, they have a very different kind of master. So have a look at what he says, verse 13. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, notice what he says there. All of us have a master, and we only have one master, and it's either money or God. And in one sense, the manager in this story, he was ultimately enslaved to a master called money, as are all the people who belong to this world. But followers of Jesus, the people of the light, they're called to love and be devoted to a very different kind of master, the one that Jesus calls God. But as long as we live in this world, we're going to be tempted to return to our old master, money. There's a very real sense in which we all have an addiction to money. Now, you might say, hang on, I'm not a slave to money. Money doesn't control me. Here's the thing about an addict. An addict never thinks they're addicted. You know, they always say, I can quit whenever I want. Likewise, we probably think that we're not addicted to money. But how do you work out if you're an addict or not? You try to give it up. If you want to know whether you're addicted to money, try giving it away. If you want to know whether it has mastery over you, just give it away. Does it hurt? Does something stop you from giving it away at the very last moment? Why not give a large chunk of money away this week? Just test yourself. See if you're under the control of money. And you say, no, you don't have control over me. Why not use money to make a friend this week? Maybe a friend who'll last to eternity. The temptation for us will be to forget that money will fail. We will forget that another future's coming. And so when we feel threatened, where are we going to turn to? We run to money. Money makes great promises about its security, but it's a lie. It's going to fail. He's a bad master. And so test yourself. Ask yourself, am I a slave to money? Who's my true master? Because the way that we use our money demonstrates who our master is. Have you ever wondered why Jesus spends so much time talking about money? You know, is it just arbitrary? Like he could have talked about pleasure or power instead. What's unique about money? I wonder if the unique thing about money is that it has a unique ability to reveal our character. If you want to know someone, just look at how they spend their money. And I wonder if that actually says a lot about how we're meant to grow in maturity as Christians. We can often think that the key measure of Christian maturity is attendance. Attendance at church, attendance at community groups, showing up to serve. And yes, someone growing in their faith will do those things. But I wonder if Jesus focuses so much on money because in reality, the primary measure of Christian maturity is generosity, not attendance. So let me ask you, what does your wallet say about you and who your master is? Just as I close, I want to finish by addressing one final complication. Because it's possible to hear all of this and to come away thinking that we can ultimately save ourselves by how we use our money, almost as if we can kind of buy or manipulate our way into heaven. That's ultimately a misunderstanding of this passage. And I want to show you that by reflecting on what kind of a master Jesus is. Who is the one whose wealth we have squandered? It's Jesus. Who is the one who comes to judge the world? It's Jesus. And who is the master who was robbed so that we could have a secure future? It's Jesus. Think about it. The only way for the manager to have a secure future is for the master to be robbed. The only way for him to have a future is for an unjust act to be done to the master. The only way for us to have a secure future is for our master to be robbed. And not just robbed of his riches, but robbed of his life. And not unwillingly, but willingly, as he gave his life for us. Can you see? There's a sense in which the death of Jesus is simultaneously the most unjust thing that ever happened. Because the creator of life was robbed of his life. And yet in that same moment, it was also the most clever thing that this world has ever seen. Because it was there through the death of his son that God secured an eternal dwelling place for undeserving people like you and me. So where do you look to see what true wisdom, true cleverness looks like? Look at the cross, where Jesus died to pay the debt that we owed for squandering his wealth. And he did it to secure an eternal dwelling. What does true cleverness look like? It looks like a man hanging on a cross, being robbed of his life so that we could have an eternal home. That's clever. And so what does it mean for us to be truly clever? First, recognize the times. Set your hope on an eternal dwelling to come. And second, use everything you have to build for that future. Make friends who will be there to celebrate. And then third, look at the cross. Remember who your true master is. Doing those things is what God thinks is clever. And if that means being a fool in this world, let's be fools for Christ. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for Jesus Christ, for his death for us. Thank you that he willingly gave himself so that we could have a home. God, help us to remember that this world is failing. Help us to fix our eyes on the age to come. And God, we pray, make us faithful with what belongs to you. God, forgive us for our disobedience. And God, we look forward to that day when we will see you along with all our friends. God, we long for that day. Amen.
We've got an opportunity right now actually to take a first step in the direction we've been called to this morning. Maybe let's just start with recognizing that all things we have are God's, recognizing our greatest treasure is God himself. Maybe that's where we can start. Let's stand and let's make that commitment together. Let's sing.